Okay, good morning, everyone. All the guests from online and the audience in the room here today. We have another meaningful discussion yesterday actually about the approach in how to write a thesis, or actually writing oneself into a thesis, and the positionality, the power. Yesterday we have been discussed quite a fruitful discussion, and today it's another session. We also have honored from our adjunct professor at Mahidol University, Assistant Professor Marcelle Cacciattolo. Sorry about that. And she is the Director, Research Training Institute of Sustainable Industry and Liveable Cities, Victoria University Research, Victoria University, Australia. And as I said, an adjunct professor at Mahidol University at Research Institute for Languages, Culture, and Asia. And today, discussions will be quite an interesting topic. Myself interested in constructivist approach, other than that we have been talking about a lot about here in Thailand recently about deconstructing the poet, and I have been using that approach to do my research. I like to go back into the constructivist one, whether or not it give any, something that might be lacking in doing research right now in Thailand as well. I hope this your talk will give a meaningful implication for also the students here and myself as a researcher. So without further ado, may I invite Marcelle to give the talk.
Thank you. And I'd just like to thank Mahidol University for hosting myself and Professor Tucker McKenna. It has been such a wonderful experience to be here. And I'd also like to thank Associate Professor Nantia, who has been instrumental in bringing us out to Thailand, and also the President Director of RILCA, Associate Professor Dr.Marcelle Meyer. And finally, I'd like to thank RILCA, and thank you, Boyd, for that great introduction. So look, welcome everyone, and I'd just like to acknowledge the people, not just who are here present in the room, but also the people who are online. So thank you. We have some online guests from Australia, which is just great. We have also some academic guests from Thailand, and I'd just like to acknowledge Gennaro Fittipaldi, my husband, and my dad, Tony Cacciattolo, who's here. And I'm pretty sure that my mother is with my father, and that's Tonya Cacciattolo. So let's start. The presentation is really looking at an interpretivist, constructivist perspective approach. And I was just having a brief conversation before I started with some doctoral students who are here and who also attended my presentation on Wednesday. And they were talking about that their methodology is a mixed methods, that they're doing both qualitative and quantitative. And it's really interesting because whenever I give this presentation, I always have students who do favour a quantitative approach, who really ask, well, why am I here? Why do I really need to know about qualitative methodology? It's not really the worldview that I adopt. And I say, you're going to be a much stronger researcher if you're able to look at the worldviews of the research from both a positivist, quantitative lens, and also a qualitative interpretivist lens. So I'll just move on to the next slide. Just really quickly, for those of you who did come to my presentation on Wednesday, I did give a bit of a brief, I'm not going to read all this out, but I did give a brief background as to who I am. So my PhD was in sociology, and I examined the lived experience of women with breast cancer, death and dying. And I also looked at how spirituality and faith was used to help support them through that difficult journey in their lives. But in terms of who I am, I think it's really important as we're thinking about our space as researchers, whether we're academics or whether we're doctoral students, it is really important that we come to think about the way in which we engage in the research process. And by that, I mean the way in which we construct knowledge through the research journey, the way in which we engage in the data collection process, the way in which we interpret the data findings that we will gather, and also the way in which we make public and the way in which we present our data findings. And all this encapsulated tells us a story about who we are in the world. And for me, my research is, and as I said on Wednesday, it is cross-disciplinary. So my research looks not only through an education lens. My research in the past has also looked at health sciences. I'm very, very, very interested in any research that engages young people and families who are the least advantaged. I'd also classify myself as a critical researcher, and I'll unpack that a bit more in the presentation. And I'll also unpack what we mean by the term criticality. So that's a bit of a snapshot about me. I am an associate professor at Victoria University. I've been at Victoria University for the past 23 years, so some time now. And during that time, I've not only engaged in the research process, I've also worked quite extensively with stakeholders in the field. And I'm also a teacher. I teach in teacher education programs, and I'm also involved in I'm the coordinator of the Master of Secondary program at Victoria University. So that's a little bit about me. So I think whenever we're starting to think about the research process, I always come back to this diagram. It's a real wonderful snapshot of how we can think about philosophical views, i.e. methodology, and how we might think about the designs, how we design our research approach, and how we might think about the methods, the research methods. And quite often, there is some confusion between the term methodology and methods, and they're very, very different. So the way I like to think about methodology is I think that it's more or less a philosophy. It's a way of seeing the world, It's a way of being in the world as we engage in the research process. So methodology as a philosophical basis is the way we position ourselves as researchers. In contrast, methods are the data tools that we use, the way in which we collect our data, and there are so many different types of methods. And I will be drawing attention to some of the methods that I have privileged in the research that I've done with schools in Melbourne, Victoria. So thinking about, there are many, many different types of philosophical worldviews. You can see on the left that 4 of the most common worldviews are the post-positivist worldview. That's a worldview where research is quantifiable and research is seen as being very black and white, that there is a truth that we can measure. The term measurement is often associated with post-positivist, that we can measure reality. We also have the constructivist worldview, and I'll talk about the constructivist worldview today, where research is seen as engaging with the participants alongside the participants. So the constructivist worldview always privileges the participants' meaning-making process of social phenomena. And that's really, really important when we're thinking about how we engage our participants in the kinds of research that we're conducting. The transformative worldview, which I also sit in, the transformative worldview is a worldview that's always about power, who has power, whose voices are being silenced in the research, whose voices are being marginalized, And the transformative worldview is about provoking, it's about critiquing, it's about challenging, not just the institutional barriers that can cause groups of people and individuals to be further marginalised, but the transformative worldview draws attention to the hidden assumptions that we carry, the values, the heteronormative spaces that occupy the way in which we engage in the world, ethnocentric values, that this is all part of the transformative worldview to draw attention and to ask the question, what can be otherwise? What can be different? And that's really powerful. The pragmatic worldview is really about, and it comes from the work of John Dewey, and the pragmatic worldview is really about problem solving, where the research is based in real life experiences, where often situated in problem-based learning, where we see that pragmatic approach to learning that has definite outcomes that are going to make a real difference in the world. So that gives you a snapshot of the different kinds of worldviews. I really, whenever I talk about research, I always come back to the work of George Kurios. He's an American educator, and he's just brilliant. And he wrote this wonderful book called The Innovator's Mindset. And what I really love about George's work is he encapsulates the kinds of qualities that innovative researchers have. So when we're thinking about you as a researcher, whether you're an academic or whether you're a doctoral student or whether you're a stakeholder, what are the kinds of qualities that you need to do your research well? And Kurios builds on the work of a very famous psychologist, academic, an American academic called Carol Dweck. And Carol Dweck coined the term a growth mindset. And a growth mindset is that mindset where we see the learning process as being lifelong, that the learning process is not the end result. The learning process, the growth mindset, is about the journey. And I would say that the research process that we undertake should always not just be about what we have at the end, whether it's a conference presentation or whether it's an article. It's also about the way in which we've engaged in the research process, whether it's through particular types of methodologies, but definitely using that mindset. So Kurios notes that an innovator's mindset extends the growth mindset. It's defined as a belief that the abilities, intelligence, and talents are developed so that they lead to the creation of new and better ideas. And every educator and every researcher should have an innovator's mindset. And they need to also think about new ways that they can extend and transform the lives of our students and also the lives of the participants that they're working with. And Kurios also says that we need to innovate inside the box, i.e. that often in our workspaces, in the lived experiences that we occupy, sometimes we look outside to try and find inspiration or innovation. And Kurios says that may not necessarily be the case, that we can often find the answers within the sites that we occupy. And so he says that we need to work within the constraints of educational settings to bring about positive and forward thinking and change. So I wanted to just pause there for a minute so that I'm not just talking at you. And I wanted you to have a think about, and I'm going to come back to this, but I want you to think about, if George Kurios came up with 8 characteristics of an innovator's mindset, what do you think those 8 characteristics might be? So I'm going to pause. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to just jot down, what do you think, if we've got researchers here, what do you think are some of the qualities that will make a researcher innovative? So 5 minutes from now, and then I'm going to ask for some responses. Drum roll. I think some people are busy Googling innovators' mindset. That's okay. I don't care. I would be doing that too. I'd be Googling as well. What is it? That's great. What are some of the qualities? Even if you come up with one. Okay. And for those of you online, please feel free to also use the chat. And I might ask Nuntia if you could look at the chat at their questions, and if you don't mind being an adjudicator, because it's just difficult for me to go in and out of screens. So for those of you online, if you want to pop in some qualities that you think, whether you've Googled it or not, that's okay. That would be wonderful. And also for those of you online, please feel free to ask questions at any time, and to also offer words of praise, because that's lovely. So let's see who is brave enough from this massive audience. I've got like 200 people in this room who have all come to see Marcelle Cacciattolo. Who would like to give me a quality that they think is required? Everyone's just jumping now, placing their hands up in the air. Anyone? What would you like to say? Maybe if you do they need to speak through the mic? Is that okay? Thank you.
Proactive and problem solving. I will add more characteristics: creativity, confidence, we are influencing. Thank you, Professor.
You are very welcome. That is wonderful. So here are some of the qualities that we heard. Creativity, that innovative researchers are creative and absolutely creative. The other one was, did you say problem solving? Absolutely. Innovative researchers solve problems, and I'll use this term very carefully. They are not reactive. They are not reactive. They don't blame. They don't put their head in the sand. They don't scream and carry on. They don't give up. They are proactive. So innovative researchers, qualitative interpretive researchers are proactive. They try and find resolutions when they're engaging in the research process, where there are little hiccups along the way. They're looking for ways in which to really move through those hiccups in pathways that are going to lead to success. And what else did you have? Did you have anything else? Was there one more? Confidence. Well, that's an interesting thing, because if we think about our confidence, sometimes our confidence as researchers is up and down. And if you think about when we begin research, often we are not confident. So when we engage, for example, when we start our doctoral journey, often we're not. We're kind of just treading water, and we work through and with our supervisors to gain that confidence. But certainly confidence is something that we develop over time. Confidence is always about voice, our voice. Having the confidence to put our voice out there. And what I find through the research process, and this is quite normal, is that researchers, beginning novice researchers, do not have a confident voice, and they often rely on the voices of theorists, which is okay, or they'll rely on the voices of their supervisors, which is okay, but then their voice gets lost, and that's really important. And as you're writing your doctoral thesis, this is something really, really important that you need to be mindful of. Confidence is about voice, and the second thing is confidence is about agency. And we talked about that term agency. We know that the most confident human beings, and if you've looked at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, his top of that hierarchy of needs is a term that we call self-actualization. We know that the individuals who we engage with in the world, who have agency, have a very strong sense of self. And when I talk about self, it's not just the self-esteem that they get from others that make them feel good. It's the self-esteem through themselves and within, and the internal dialogue that happens. And this all very much connects to research. So when we're going through as researchers, that we need to recognize our agency in the process. Who has the power and who has the control? And the researcher certainly needs to make sure and to ensure that they do have the power. And so just really quickly, I'm not going to spend too much time. I'm just conscious. This is a really great diagram of all the different qualities of an innovator's mindset. And we look at, and it's not just, when I talk about this diagram, I never just ever link this to research. This is about being an effective citizen. This is about being an effective individual in the world. Having these qualities is really important. So we talk about the notion of being empathic, that the innovative researcher, the innovative constructivist, interpretivist researcher, the innovative researcher full stop, is empathic. And what we mean by the term empathic, that he, she, or they can stand in the shoes of the participant, that they understand the standpoint of the participant. And that's a really important skill. Another important skill is around that problem finding that we spoke about. They find solutions to problems, and they are proactive. They take risks. And I love this term. They take calculated risks, not stupid risks. Yeah? When we talk about risks, they are well thought out risks. They also have, and this is interesting, whenever I show this diagram to an audience and I go and I say, well, which of these qualities do you think you need to work on? Almost always it's the networking quality that participants say, you know what, I actually need to network more, because we know good researchers are well networked. They have excellent communication skills. They have strong connections to stakeholders. They have strong connections to and international and global and domestic connections. They're observant. Good researchers observe. They don't just observe through their lens. Effective researchers are not just looking through a narrow window of what they perceive as being the right way. In fact, effective, innovative researchers try to observe and try to do this in a very fluid and ethno-relative way. They're open to different dialogues. They're open to different cultural interpretations. And they also have a high intercultural competency, a sense of being able to work within different cultures in very, very respectful ways. They are creative. We've spoken about that. And they are resilient. For those of you who came to Talcum and my presentation on Wednesday, you'll recall that there was one of the HDR students, doctoral students, spoke about some of the challenges that she faced during COVID. And one of the points that we made was that she was very resilient. And in fact, innovative researchers bounce back. And when we talk about resilience can often be misinterpreted as being really strong, really aggressive, taking no for an answer. And in fact, that is not the correct term of resilience. Resilience is also about understanding those aspects of our research that we have no control over. Resilient researchers also understand when they are floundering, when they are failing. Resilient researchers understand, and this is the key. And if you want to do some reading on this, have a look at Karen Ravich's work. She wrote this brilliant book called The Resilient Factor. And one of the things that she talks about is that resilient people reach out. And I'm going to tie that back to researchers. Resilient researchers will reach out when things are not going their way, and they'll reach out to very, very different resources, hopefully their supervisors. Finally, innovative researchers are reflective. They hold the mirror up and they look at their own gaze. They look at what they've done. They ask questions about their own positionality, and we'll get to that term. Resilient, they're reflective, and they understand that being reflective is a necessary phase of being a lifelong learner, and indeed being reflective is necessary for that term that I use, the growth mindset. So have a think about that, and George Kurios's work and his book, again, he's written a book, The Innovator's Mindset, is just a great read. Okay.
Do you want to ask something?
Yes.
Hello, good morning. I want to ask, you mentioned about this, but how about in cultural context? Because I'm from Indonesia. I'm like young researcher, I'm PhD student. I always look down because I don't have experience because I'm a PhD candidate. But at the same time, because you're young, and then I don't have the voice because I don't have like senior researcher or probably like such lecturer, they are still masters or something like that. They still look down on me because usually a presentation they don't want, like, Alisa, you're in the back, you cannot present anything during this time. So what do you think about that? Thank you.
I think that's thank you for commenting. That's such a brilliant comment that you've made, and I'll just try and summarize that so that I'm listening carefully to what you're saying. What you're saying is, I'm a young student. You're also female, so I'm going to throw that in the mix. Yeah, you're also in a country where you're the other. So you're from Indonesia. You are at a Thai university, so you are a minority. So from an ethnic cultural standpoint, you're not really. You come from a different cultural space, so you're occupying different cultural spaces. Your comment was also about, how do I have a voice, or how do I have an agency when I'm just starting my doctoral journey, and I don't feel, often it's about how you feel. I don't feel like I can present my voice with a sense, and I'll use the term authority, with a sense of authority. And in saying that, correct me if I'm wrong, that your perception is that sometimes you're also not given that space. You're not given that space, and you're not given that space often by the institution. Could be the institution. Yeah.
Not only institution, but because they're older, like they're more senior. Because I was like, at that time I was like 20 years old. They're like, you're the baby here, because it's like I'm always the youngest in the room. And then even though I'm PhD student, they don't look at me as a PhD student. They always see me as a female and also young.
So I'll quickly summarize what I think. What you're experiencing is quite normal. It's very normal. So being young, being female, being new to an institution, you're working with supervisors who are highly credentialed. Many supervisors have a reputation and a brand, and often it's their voice. And so when you're writing your PhD, it's often their theoretical. They'll tell you what theory to write about. Yeah, they'll help you to design your research, and they have a very strong stamp. My advice to you is that we need to recognise that we are here. We have arrived at the university. We are doctoral students because we've done something right. We don't just arrive at a PhD because we're lucky. We arrive at a PhD because we've engaged in a lot of hard work because we have had agency, we have had voice, and we are at a beginning stage of our academic career. In saying that, we recognise that we will work with our supervisors, but it's also around negotiating that space. How do we negotiate that space of voice with and alongside our supervisors? I'll give you a really, really quick example. I remember the first time I was a doctoral student. This is a very true story. I was a doctoral student. I started my PhD. I was very young. Well, I looked very young and I was very young. And I remember going to speak to my doctoral, my supervisor was a professor. He wasn't only a professor, he was the DVC of research of the whole university. And I remember one particular meeting early on, where I had gone into his office and he had read some of my writing and he was giving me feedback on my writing. And there was another one of his students and he said, look, I'm really busy. I need you both in the room at the same time. I'm going to speak to you individually. And he started with this student who was doing a PhD in nursing, and he was extraordinarily rude and aggressive to this PhD student. He said that his writing was no good, that he needed to really work on his writing. And he wasn't really, he wasn't empathic. He wasn't empathic at the time, and he was actually quite rude. He then started on to me and used the same energy. He said to me that my writing really didn't quite capture the mark, that I needed to go back and to make sure that it was not his job. Let me say that it's always about tone. We can say things very politely, but his tone was quite rude. It was not his job to correct my work. I was furious that he had A, dared to speak to me like that, and B, dared to speak to me like that in front of a peer. I was angry. I went home and I thought about it. And I rang him up and I said to him, don't you please, I said, I recognise that you're a professor. I'm respectful of you in this space, but you have no right to speak to me in that rude way, that I am learning alongside you, that you're my mentor, you're my coach, but you need to make sure, and this is what I said, you need to make sure that every time I leave your office, that not only are you being critical in a respectful way, that I'm made to feel worthy. So I actually in that space, I actually challenged him. I'm not saying everyone can do that, but I did. And I'm telling you that he was just so brilliant. But I was lucky. I had a supervisor who thought, you know what, I was actually quite rude, and he was reflective. Not all supervisors are like that. So to sum up, I think it's really important that I had agency. I had agency and I had voice, and I named it. It's really about how you do that. If you don't feel confident doing that, then I think you'd maybe speak to someone who you trust, who can work alongside you in that space with the supervisor, and also recognizing it's a gradual process. Okay? All right. So let's move on. I'm just conscious of the time. Positionality. For those of you, you'll recall that Talcum and I really did unpack our positionality. And Talcum, you can see that gorgeous photo of Talcum and I. Talcum and I have done so much great work together. But positionality is really, and this is, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but if you think about a definition, and we're thinking about the interpretivist constructivist approach, we need to unpack our positionality. And here's a really neat definition. And then once I read this definition, I'm actually going to ask Talcum to talk about his positionality. But before I do that, in thinking about carrying out research, we need to try and increase our awareness of the assumptions we bring with us to the field of inquiry. So that positionality is always about interrogating, critiquing, unearthing the hidden assumptions that we bring to the table. And there are many reasons and there are many factors that cause those assumptions. In writing about our research, we need to try and explain to the readers, not just the readers, the examiners, for those of you that are doing a thesis, how we see our position in relation to our research. My positionality is that I'm a white, heterosexual female who has from a Western background and who comes from a Western culture. My positionality is that my religion is Catholic. I do not have a disability. I am not impaired. And so all of these factors, I'm Australian, and also my cultural background is that I come from a Maltese cultural background. And all these factors influence the way in which I see myself and the way in which I engage in research and the way in which I interpret research. Tarkan, would you like to just talk about your positionality?
Yeah, thank you, Marcelle. Essentially, I echo a lot of your values and positions. The essential difference is that I do have disability, I do have life-threatening illnesses, I do have a tradition that informs me, which is excluded from many ways of knowing in Australia. It's changed, that is being identified as a gay researcher and being accused variously of pushing the one, or wheeling the one wheelbarrow. I actually don't think I've written about gay or lesbian stuff since 2004, but that's how people see me. My own belief system is very, very much to one of processual learning, and the products that emerge through the process are equally valuable, but not always more valuable. So in that gift of 5 years or 3 years, or in my instance, 8 years, I think I took to do the PhD because I was doing it part-time, that process was particularly important. I think the performance of your identity as a PhD student is so complex that it does you well to ask yourself the question of who am I in relationship to the institution, the country in which you're undertaking the PhD, and indeed your supervisor or supervisors.
Thank you. So I've got another activity around positionality, but I've got a handout, and Nanti, would you mind uploading the handout to the online? They don't need to do it. Do you have it on there? And I'm just going to give out a handout. So I'm not going to wait. It's too long an activity, but I just like some of the themes in this handout that really drill down into all those factors that influence our positionality. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to have a look at these underlying themes, and then we'll come back and we'll unpack some of these underlying themes. All right? Thanks. Have you found it? So for those of you that are online, we're just gonna, if you're not familiar with Zoom, there's what's called a chat box, and we're gonna upload the handout that I've just distributed to people here in the audience. And Nantia has just popped that in the chat. If you go to the chat and click on the chat, you'll see the handout that we're looking at the moment around aspects of positionality. Yes, please. And Nantia will also upload my presentation as a PDF in the chat as well. Okay, so I'll give you a few more minutes and then we're going to unpack some of these aspects of our lives that position who we are. Okay, so if you've got the handout in front of you, and for those of you online, if you're able to download the handout. Look, there are so many elements to positionality. These are just some. If we think about often our race, the color of our skin, the way, the features, our physical features, that is often a determinant of our positionality in life. If we think about our ethnicity, our culture, the geographical landscape where we originate from, that can be attributed also to our positionality. Our nationality, as we know, many people will have dual nationalities. I classify myself as not just Australian, but my background is Maltese. So it's also navigating our nationalities, our identity, economic class, whether we come from a particular substrata of an economic class, whether we consider ourselves working class or middle class or upper class, and thinking also about the Indian caste system. I mean, India has got a whole nation built on the caste system that determines who you are, who you can marry, land you can occupy, kinds of jobs that you can take on. So we've got economic class, our social status, our gender, and knowing that gender is a social construct. It's different to our biology, our gender, whether we identify as male, female, whether we identify as intersex, that all, whether transsexual, pansexual, all these aspects of gender, bisexual, have impact the way in which we position ourselves in the world. Sexual orientation, our age, our religion, our ability, and there are others as well. And when we're coming to write, when we spoke on Wednesday about positionality and how you write yourself into your thesis, this is a really, really good checklist for you to consider. If you're wanting to write a piece about your positionality, when you're writing yourself into your thesis, have a look at some of these terminologies and think about whether you might want to also weave in some of these terms into your writing. Are there any comments before I move on around some of these terms, or indeed you might have other terms that you think could be added to this list?
Marcelle, I know from your experience, you were inducted into your research field for 1 year before you actually began your research. And the principle of knowing your co-participants sometimes, as in your instance, your PhD was on women with breast cancer, was particularly important. Would you like to speak briefly to why that happened? Because I think that's one that could be added in terms of life experience or life world of the co-participants.
So when I first chose my topic, I went to my supervisor, such a lovely man, and I say that, a brilliant man. Unfortunately, he passed away during COVID, but just a beautiful man. And I went to Professor Gary Baumer, and I said, Gary, I've decided what I'm going to write my PhD on. He said, what are you doing your PhD on? I said, I'm going to write on women with breast cancer and death and dying. And Gary said, and what do you know of dying? And I said, I don't really know anything about dying. I haven't had anyone pass away. My grandmother had passed away when I was 13. But aside from that, I didn't really understand the notion of illness or the notion of grief or the notion of cancer. And my Professor Gary Baumer said, Marcelle, you are going to speak to your participants about the most intimate aspect of their lives. What kind of authenticity do you have as a researcher when you are sitting there face to face? Why should a female who has lived through breast cancer tell their story to you? He said, I actually don't think we're going to, because you all know that you've got to submit ethics before you engage in any research, whether it's with animals or with people. You have to get ethics approval. I hadn't received any ethics approval. And Gary said, you need to go and do some work before you approach the women. And so I did. I trained as a palliative carer. I also engaged in volunteer work for 2 years with palliative patients, with people who were dying. And that was a really important milestone to answer Tarquin. That was an important milestone before I actually approached my participants, that gave me a real solid, even though I was not experienced myself or had the death of a close one, other than my grandmother, but it was remarkable to have had that experience. And then imagine having done that work for 2 years and then researching women. It meant that my positionality and my understanding was much more wider. It was much more wider. So that's really, that's part of my journey, Tarquin, as a researcher.
I think, though, that it's also an underrated, the real world experience of the field. You'll hear later around Paulo Freire and how he lived in the real world. He didn't do research per se, but his principles impact across the globe. I think on this positionality activity list, what real world contributions have impacted on you? You know, something like that. I know, because not everybody has the opportunity to have supervisors who were that empathic to the worldview of people at this space of moving on in life. And so I think your example is particularly important to everyone to recognize, you know. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move on. So here's just a look. There are so many different definitions of interpretive constructivist studies, but here are some definitions that encapsulate what we mean by this term as a research methodology. So the interpretivist paradigm allows the researcher to recognise and narrate the meanings associated with human experiences. So the interpretivist and constructivist approach to research is really, really centred on the subjectivity of the participant, the lived experiences, the internal dialogue. The interpretivist paradigm is really asking questions like, how does it feel? What do you think? Tell me about a time when you ... So this kind of worldview is committed to ensuring that the participant's voice is at the centre of the research paradigm. That's very different to a positivist quantitative worldview. And a positive quantitative worldview will ask questions like, what's the number? How many? What are the causal effects? What's the percentage? Very, very different questions that are being asked. And just so when we think about the interpreters in terms of interpretive studies as a definition, it's also, this approach is about engaging in the research process. It's based on understanding the meanings associated with social phenomena and how social phenomena is socially constructed. Participants interpret the world through their own subject and intersubject encounters in their everyday lives. The role of the interpretivist researcher, and this is really important, is to pry open the lived experience of participants so that their perceptions of events and incidences are privileged, and that's the main game, that their voices, their worldviews are privileged. The interpretivist researcher understands that the standpoints of participants to social events vary and that there are many truths. So the social constructivist view doesn't look at social phenomena or interpreting social phenomena as just being black or white, fact or fiction. Because the interpretive social constructivist view looks at social phenomena through a grey lens, that there are many, many truths. There are many ways of reading or interpreting a story, and that depends on the life, worlds and history of the participants. So just to give you some examples, and this is really, these are just some, there are many examples. You may or may not be familiar with some of these terms if you've done some reading in the field of qualitative research. And here are some pretty common types of interpretive research methodologies that researchers will use in the field and that doctoral students will use. So we have what's called ethnographic research, and that comes from the field of anthropology. Anthropologists, very famous anthropologists like Clifford Geertz, really coined the term ethnography, and that's really where researchers will situate, in situ is the word, they'll situate themselves in the actual geographical and cultural context of the space. They'll occupy themselves in the space that they're studying. So we often find anthropologists, for example, who are doing research. They might be doing research on groups of people or different cultures, will go and live with a community for a particular amount of time to really get a sense of sight, of smell, of culture, of nuances in terms of beliefs and rituals. So that's where we have the term ethnography. We've spoken about qualitative. Qualitative is really research that is about meaning making, of which the constructivist paradigm sits. Action research is very popular amongst practitioners and teachers. So teachers will often engage in an action research project where they start with a question, They'll plan the question, they'll trial some data collection tools, they'll collect their data, they'll answer their questions, and then it's cyclic and it goes on, and then they'll move on to another question. Case study is very, very common. The researchers will often engage in case studies, maybe on institutions, maybe on groups of people. Case studies can also be a very unique way of drilling down to particular groups in terms of their particular beliefs and their particular values. And case studies can also be an opportunity to include narratives. We've also got symbolic interactionists, which is around the symbols, the meanings that people will associate through their lived experiences. Phenomenological research is around looking at social phenomena, the way in which phenomena emerges, and how do we interpret social phenomena? How do we make meaning from social phenomena? The constructivist approach is what we're talking about now. This research works alongside participants. This constructivist approach says that the research is really around the researcher and the participant co-constructing the meaning that emerges from the research process, co-constructing. So the researcher is not there to dictate what the research findings should look like, but in actual fact, it's working alongside, and that's really important. Collaborative practitioner research is a research methodology that I'm going to spend the next hour talking about. I'm going to draw down on a research project that I did with teachers using a collaborative practitioner research methodology. So I'll leave that there for the moment because I'm going to come back to that. And narrative inquiry. For those of you, narrative inquiry has really become quite central through the work of Jean Clendenin, and she's a beautiful Canadian scholar who really looked at the way in which stories and the storied lives that people tell are important, and they're important through the data collection process. And when we're thinking about Jean Clendenin's work around narrative inquiry, she says that if we're using stories to collect data, that we really need to look at the three parts of a story. We need to look at the temporality, the time the story took place. If someone's telling you about a story, what was the time? What was the historical time in terms of when the event occurred? The sociology that's around, who are the people involved? What were the kinds of relationships that emerged? And also the place. What was the geographical place in which the story occurred? So these are just it's a snapshot of some of the different types of approaches. I wanted to just pause here, and I think it's really important. I'm also going to ask Chalcom to comment about this, but when people ask me, Marcelle, what kind of worldview do you have? I always I situate myself in between an interpretivist and a constructivist, but I always situate myself in a transformative worldview. And what that means is that I'm very selective as well in terms of the kinds of research that I do. I choose to engage in research where I feel that I'm able to really delve into oppressive forces. And so that umbrella or that type of research comes under what we call critical theory. So here we have a bit of a definition around critical theory. Critical theorists have advocated that social research should be a call to action, that we engage in research to really make changes, whether it's through government policies, whether it's through the kinds of rules that institutions are embodying, whether it's through speaking back to particular groups or organisations that may be silencing. This call to action is a particular lens through which a critical transformative approach, that's what it embodies. So the research needs also want to ensure that researchers are champions who have a moral and social commitment. So these researchers are very much ethically and socially and morally committed to addressing inequity and oppression. And also a call to action is around making sure that the research questions that we ask, the way in which we conduct our research, the way in which we analyse our research is done in a way that's going to make sure that all participant voices are represented. Did you want to say anything, Talcum, about the call to action?
The essential element for me is that there will be some action as opposed to inertia as a consequence of the research. And usually that action is for me, in the form of a social reconstruction of something which was less than adequate. I use the terminology less than adequate because one of my main teachers was Moreno, a psychodramatist, and he taught how we can use different roles in our lives to undertake the discovery of data, but for him, the power of the action that comes out of the discovery is particularly important. Social action, community action, yeah.
Thank you. Social action, community action, and you can see the book there. Some of you may be familiar with Paulo Freire's work, very famous Brazilian social and political activist. And Paulo Freire was an educator and a scholar, and he was born in 1921 and he died in May 1997. And I won't go into too much detail, but he is the epitome of a critical theorist. He was a Brazilian activist. He was exiled from Brazil because he worked alongside illiterate peasants, and he worked with illiterate peasants, and he taught them not just to read, but not just to read the word, but to read the world. So through his work, he was able to adopt what we call a praxis inquiry approach. And through his work with illiterate peasants, he was also able to give them a sense of agency. And that's very powerful. And it's a really great book if you haven't read, it gives you a sense of this work. I just wanted to shift the attention now from looking at definitions of this paradigm to giving you some concrete examples, because I think that the concrete examples is really where we start to think about what does this look like in practice. And collaborative practitioner research is very much an interpreter's constructivist approach that I have used during my time as an academic and as a PhD student and as a researcher. And the collaborative practitioner research approach that I've used, that's CPR, it really is when the research from the start to the finish is a co-participatory research approach with the participants. So the participants really they co-develop and they think about not just the design of the research. They not only contribute to the research process, then they not only tell you their story, but they actually engage in the data analysis alongside the researcher, which is quite unique. Traditionally, a lot of research is done in isolation with researchers. They'll come, they'll do research on people. They'll take the research away. They'll analyse that research. They'll come up with findings. And often the participants are really left with very little. And to link that back to Talcum's notion of action, that CPR is the exact opposite of that kind of approach. And CPR really involves the participants in every stage of the research, and that they also feel that they have a sense of ownership on the data and on the interpretation, on the findings. And I think that's really, really important. So you can see here in the definition, it's really about engaging the members and the stakeholders. It's around collaboration. It's about the quality of partner relationships. There's a shared sense of a vision and a mission. There's a shared sense of relationships about building, rebuilding. There's a sense of trust between the researcher and the participants, and that there's also an opportunity to ensure that the participants feel that they are partners in the process. So I just wanted to talk to you about a project that I did some time ago that involved 6 schools, and it involved teachers. So we worked with 6 schools, 3 primary schools, 3 secondary schools. Do you use those terms in Thailand, or do you use what terms do you use for primary and secondary schools? Do you use So you use primary. Okay. So I worked with the teachers at these schools, and the aim of this project was to look at the practices of the teachers, to look at their pedagogical approaches, their teaching styles, and to look at the curriculum, and to look at the institutional policies, to see how the teachers, their teaching approach, their lesson planning, how that was catering for the needs of students who came, and their families who came from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So this project was interested to hear from the teachers as to what they were doing in their classroom. What were they doing that was either hindering or encouraging students from low SES backgrounds to thrive and flourish? And it was a really powerful, powerful project. And one of the data collection tools that we used, and that I'm going to unpack and give you an example, I'm actually going to give you an example, is called case writing. Case writing. So the teachers wrote about a case, not to be confused with case study, it's very different. Teachers wrote about a case of practice, an incident in their classroom. And it was an incident that was emotionally charged. It was emotionally charged. And I'm just going to show you that we'll just talk about case and why we write cases. And it also comes from the work of Judith Schulman and Lee Schulman. And they talk about this case writing tool. It's very popular with practitioners and teachers. And it gives teachers and practitioners an opportunity to write themselves in. It's essentially a story. It's essentially a story. Teachers and practitioners write a story about a dilemma or a key incident or a contradiction or an achievement or an unresolved incident that they want to explore further. When participants are writing their cases, it's very thick with emotion. So the case in and of itself describes not just what happened and not just the event, but how people felt and what their responses were and what their reactions were. So this is a data tool that I really use quite often. So you can see that the description includes not only what happened, the context, the consequences of action, the participants' responses, and the writer's thoughts and feelings. What's equally important, that when participants are writing their story, and this is really, really important, is that they share it, they make it public. It's one thing to write your story. It's another thing to keep it hidden where no one can really read and engage in critical dialogue. And this is also a part of the case writing process, that people listen to other people's cases and they comment on them, because we all see different things when depending on our positionality, and that's exactly what we did. So just really clearly, I've talked about why we write cases, either to solve problems. This is why we might write a case, to see an event in a new way, to provide new understandings, to uncover hidden meanings, to explore feelings, explore better ways to teach, in the case for the participants, the teachers, to perform in the workplace, and in the case of the teachers, they wanted to improve their teaching and their learning. And they also wanted to make sure that they were engaging in inclusive and socially just principles. That was what was the goal. So that's a bit of a mind map. When we're writing a case, these are the different parts of a case. You'll have a setting, you'll have key players, a key incident, you'll have emotions, you'll have a storyline, that these all form parts of a case. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to pause now and I'd like to share with you a case that one of the teachers wrote when I was engaging in research. This teacher was a first-year out teacher. She was on a contract and she wrote a case called The Case of Lucky. So I'm going to, for those of you online, we're going to upload this case online. And for those of you here, I'm going to give you this case. And I'm just going to give you about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. I want you to read the case. This is actual data. This is a data that has emerged from this project about one teacher's experience with a Vietnamese school student in Year 7 who presented with particular types of issues. So we'll pause here. I'll give you 10 minutes. And please feel free, if you're here in the audience, to also talk about the case with the person sitting next to you. Okay, we're going to pause now. Okay, let's come back. So, I wanted to share this case with you for you to have a sense of this as a data collection tool that you could use. For those of you that are doing research, whether you're an academic or whether you're a researcher or whether you're a doctoral student, that this is a legitimate data collection tool to ask your participant to write a case about an event that's meaningful, that's tied to your topic. And you can see when you're reading this case, it flows. It has a beginning and it has an end. That the teacher has used language that's highly emotive. We can really have a sense of the emotions at play, can't we? And that's really, really important. So when we're reading about the teacher and her recount of the event, we get a sense of some of the frustrations that she was experiencing. But at the same time, we start to understand some of the hidden assumptions that the teacher had at the start of the case. And that's really, really central, because that's what research should be doing. It should be looking for those elements of hidden assumptions. And it should also be asking, how can these hidden assumptions be brought to the surface? And this is what the case has done. It has brought to the surface an event that, if she hadn't have written this down, maybe may have just stayed as an event in her mind. What's important was that this teacher worked with 4 of us in a group. We each read the case and we were able to give her feedback about the case. And that's really important. But I wanted to just pause and invite you, whether you're online or whether you're here face to face, about what you think about this case. Was there anything that kind of leaped to your attention when you were reading this case? Anyone?
Can I say something? From what I've read, I had an impression that it probably might out of the context of this, but I question her sincerity. I don't know whether or not she is. I mean, it might be in different contexts. If this research apply in probably in the Thai context, the way she writes seems to me to be quite, I mean, I would say, show the path that is good to herself, like she a helpful teacher or something like that. But I might be, I mean, gone too far to think about it. But in some location, in some places or some social status, someone might try to show off that she do something good for someone, and I guess that probably might affect the overall finding or interpretation of the case.
So that's a really good point. So you're, Boyd, you're saying that you're questioning the legitimacy of the teacher's intent in the way that she's writing this case. And that from a Thai cultural context, that for a teacher to write about something good, it may be perceived as though they're showing off. Is that right? Okay, well, that's very much a valid interpretation from your positionality. And yes, I can understand how this case may be seen in that way. Thank you. Any other comments around anything to do with the case? No? Yes?
The way that she chose Lucky as a subject, because this probably the teacher have a lot of students, but like why the teacher choose this person, I think that is something special or like memorable for her, or something that still think about it.
Okay, that's another excellent point. And what you're saying is, how do we choose the stories that we share or that we choose to tell? Why did this teacher choose to write about Lucky when she probably had 100 other incidences? And I don't have the answer to that. But what I can say, that it was significant enough for her to write about it. And that says something. So it was significant, and that it was an unresolved tension. This case was drafted 2 or 3 times. This is the final polished case. This is not how it started. And in actual fact, we met 2 or 3 times for the case to evolve into what you see now. But at the start, the case was really around this dilemma, and she didn't understand. She was a new teacher. She was in a position, she didn't have a lot of power. She was on a contract. She was not ongoing. And that was also significant for her, because she was new to the profession, and she really wanted to question what she could do differently. How was she contributing to this unequal space? And it's very clear, because the story does talk about her assumptions. She thought that Lucky wasn't smiling because he was disengaged. And that was actually not the case. And she later finds out the reason why Lucky's not smiling when she's at the sports carnival is because of his teeth and his gums. And if anything, what we can learn from this teacher is she was willing to put herself out there for critique. And that's part of this methodology. So often, I see it all the time. I see practitioners, academics who are too scared to have people critique their work. And we can understand that, and that's complex. There are many reasons. But when you enter into this space of case writing, and when you make your work public, you are also courageous. Whether or not people are interpreting that story, you are courageous, because you're saying, I'm actually not perfect. And I really would like to have the opportunity to share an area of my teaching that I'd like to improve on. And I think that's something that we need to celebrate in any type of research, where we have not just the participants, but the researchers who are also putting themselves out there as well. That's one of the great, really, really great responses. And look, we can interpret this in so many different ways, and that's the richness of the interpreter's paradigm. I'm just giving you one kind of lens. And so what happens though, if you think about the research process, you've got a case, you're going to write about the case. What do you do then? What do you do then? So I've got this case as a researcher. I'm using the collaborative practitioner research. How do I make meaning of this case? And so this is what we did. Many of you will be familiar with thematic coding, where you look at huge chunks of text and you code it for meaning, and that's exactly what we did. And that's the table. We looked at the text and we coded each other's cases. And what we did, and drawing on the work, thematic analysis, we looked at what we call open coding. We used an open coding approach where we categorized and broke down the data into chunks, word for word. That was the first phase. We took out sentences that we thought were relevant, or phrases or passages. And then from that, we grouped these sentences and these passages into umbrella themes. That's called axial coding. That's the second phase of thematic analysis. And you can see here in this diagram some of the ways that the cases were dissected. And that's exactly what we would have done with what we did with Lucky's case. So I think that's important too, not just for this case and not just for this story, but if you're using qualitative research, if you're using interviews, if you're using participant observation, if you're using focus group transcripts, how are you going to code your data? Some people will use data approaches to coding their data. That comes out of the work of Lynn Richards and her husband Tom Richards from La Trobe University. You may be familiar of the program NVivo. NVivo is very famous. So some people will use a software program called NVivo that will actually help you to code your data. Other people will just do it manually. And obviously, if you're quantitative, many of you will be using SPSS. So it's how do you code it? And then once you've coded it, how do you come up with data themes? And then once you've come up with the data themes, how do you write about those data themes in a coherent way? So this is one example. So I'm just going to finish because I want to leave some time for questions. And these are questions for anyone engaging in any research, whether it's qualitative or quantitative or mixed method, or if you're using a particular methodology. And this is a question that your supervisor and yourself, if you're a doctoral student, these are questions you should be really asking and engaging in these conversations with your supervisor. Or if you're part of a research project or a research team, these are really, really valuable questions and conversations that you should be having. So the first is, it's the very common question, how much data is enough? How much data should we collect? How do we know when to stop? How do we know when we've really captured the answers to the research questions that we're seeking to investigate? So that's the first question. How much data is enough? The second question is, how do you know what you found is not what you were looking for? And for many researchers, and there's a book that's called Research That Goes Off the Rails. It's a brilliant book. Research That Goes Off the Rails. And so for many researchers, they'll begin with a research, and we spoke about this on Wednesday, research question in mind, a research process, and by the end of it, it's completely gone off track. Or the data collection is actually not what they thought it was going to be. Or during COVID, many of my students who were doing research in schools, the schools were shut down. So they had no access to the teachers or the students. So they found it very difficult to really delve into their questions. And no doubt for many of you who spoke about COVID, and you spoke about COVID, that was also a time where data collection was compromised for many students, for us in Australia, but worldwide. Thinking about also publication, Mark Vickers, who spoke on Monday, and Tuckwam are very experienced authors, and they publish quite extensively. And thinking also about why we do research, and it's really important about if we're going to publish, is it difficult to publish qualitative research studies? Many research disciplines do not value qualitative research. They do not. They value positivist research because they feel that often qualitative research is a bit argy-bargy. It can be too general, too generalizable, and it really isn't capturing a great portion of the population. So interestingly, it's saying, is qualitative research considered less acceptable than quantitative? And I'm wondering, I'm here at the wonderful Mahidol University, the most prestigious university in Thailand, and I'm wondering as an institution where this institution sits. And I would argue it would have to depend on the disciplines of the university. The different disciplines will look at research in very different ways. So, for example, social sciences, history, if we're looking at research in education, or if we're looking at research in some of the literary domains, qualitative research is very, very popular. However, if we're thinking about disciplines such as engineering, science, mathematics, certain aspects of IT, that very much economics, business, that very much quantitative research is very much privileged, and also it's deemed as being the research that often gets published in Q1 journals. So this is something we need to consider as researchers. Where do we make public our research? Where is it most valued? And Mark Vickers and Tarquin would say, it's about where you choose to publish your work. And that's the most important point. The journals that you approach, making sure that your research is aligning with those journals and the standpoint of the journals. And finally, is qualitative research, interpreted as constructivist research, is this something that a PhD student should consider? There are some supervisors who will not do qualitative research. They don't see it as being viable. They don't see it as being important enough, or they don't see qualitative research as being an area where they feel you're going to get some real hard, fast data. So I'm going to stop there and thank you. I would like also to pause, even we will finish in 10 minutes, I think. I'd just like to pause if there are any questions about any of the points that I've raised, and I really do hope you have at least one question. And thank you all very much for your time. Just like to also give a thank the participants online for being here and for listening. And also, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat. So over to you. Any questions? Please, someone just ask one question. One, even about how fantastic I am. Any?
If not, may I first to ask a question? Recently, I'm planning to do a kind of research that involve participant reflection, but I plan to do it through journaling. Like I'm trying to investigate a student's motivation in learning translation, and I plan to do that, involve that in writing reflection through that journal. Do you think is it similarity or differences between case writing?
That's such a cool question. And I get that often. What's the difference between journal writing and case writing? That's really cool. Journal writing will often be, can be, but there are similarities. They're both, journals will be often around a story. Yeah. Journals are often, can be a recount of events. Yeah. And so can case writing. It can be a story, it can be a recount. The difference, I would argue, between the journal and the case writing is what you do with the piece of information that you're writing about. That often when we write journals, it can be quite private. Yeah. So when we write a journal, we're often writing it for ourselves or for someone else to read. In contrast, when we're writing cases or case writing, we're entering into a public space or a public sphere. Yeah. Where it's not just the case writing that's the process as a methodological process, it's listening for others to see how they're also interpreting the story. I think that you're choosing journals is wonderful. I would also encourage you, and I say this to all my PhD students, and I also say this when I chair PhD candidature committees, I also say, and I did this when I did my PhD, it's important that you keep your own journal. Keeping your own journal is powerful because what you're doing is you're recording, you're reflecting on the mind shifts that are occurring for you as you journey through the PhD. And indeed, when I wrote up my thesis, I included my journal entries as my data. It wasn't just the journals of the participants, it was also my mind shifts. Remember, you'll recall my story about doing the volunteer work in a hospice and a hospital. I kept a journal. Now I couldn't use the participants. I didn't have ethics, but I could talk about my mind shift in terms of those encounters that I was having and my experiences with people who were dying. The other point I'd make, and this is really important, is that often when we give participants the opportunity to write a journal, what they give you may not necessarily be what you think you would want, or that it's answering your question. Yeah. And so I would also encourage you that if you're asking your participants to write a journal, to give them some prompts. Not that we don't want to over structure, but at the same time, you have a small window to collect that data. You do, because the PhD goes very quickly. You have a small window to collect the data. So you want to make sure any data that you're collecting is going to give voice to your research questions that you're answering. Did you want to say something?
Yes, that's what the point I'd like to ask you, whether or not we should frame how they write the diary, and as you answer that, it should be something like a prompt, like otherwise the data will be everywhere.
Well, and
yes.
Otherwise, you might just have a journal entry that's only recount about the ice cream that they ate and the colours that they ate and the person that they met on the street and blah, 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 blah. And what's not happening is that the journal entry in itself is not showing the transformation of thinking, of interaction. And that's where the power comes from, because we know that all effective research, and to use Talcum's language, is always about transformation and change. Research that does not do anything, that sits, PhD research that sits in a very nice little bounded leather book, very nice on a bookshelf, but if it's collecting dust, that research has been done and it's wasted. So that's really important. I'll give you another tool that I use when I'm doing interviews. And this has been a really great tool. I ask the participant to bring in an artifact to the interview that represents a particular element of the interview that I'm seeking to explore. Say, for example, I'll give you an example. If I was wanting to find out what teachers believed was effective in their teaching approach, I would ask them to bring in an artifact that best represented what they think good teaching is about. And some people say, Marcelle, what do you mean by an artifact? Yeah? What does an artifact mean? And I say, well, an artifact could be a song, it could be a photo, an artifact could be a poem, an artifact could be an ornament that sits in your bookcase, an artifact could be a gift that a student has given you. An artifact could be anything, but that's also a useful technique when you've got a participant. And what happens is because often participants can be quite nervous when they start speaking. They're like, oh, am I saying the right thing? Do I sound smart enough for the researcher? And that's actually not what we want. We want the participant to feel comfortable. And if they start from a place of knowing, which is aligned to their artifact, you will find more often than not that you've started to bring them in to feeling comfortable to tell their story. Okay, I'm just conscious about the time. Everyone's, having a barrel of laughs here. Nantia.
Yeah, I just want to add something just for you. Being reflective about your own journey to the research is really important, and it will allow you to identify or to pinpoint certain aspects that you have done or you haven't done through the research. And that is a process of learning. And I would encourage you, because Thai students, they are scared of, saying like, this is the weakness of my research, the weak area of my research. But no research is perfect. So, through the reflection, you will encounter your own weakness or your own work weaknesses. So that is part of the study. That is part of the information that you can include in the projects. So, the reader knows what is the limitation. So they don't, over generalize or over believe in your work. So they can make judgment through that. Yeah.
Thank you. And that's such an important point, and we'll end on that point. But Nantia is absolutely right. that often when we're writing, we're too scared. Again, I'll say we're too scared to present the challenges and the weaknesses, when in actual fact, that's showing your journey. And if we're thinking about what effective research, as Nantia beautifully said, research is never perfect. Research is messy. Research is challenging. Research causes us to really rethink and think out of the square. And if you're finding yourself questioning or doubting, then that's actually part of the research process. It's normal. What is important, as Nantia said, is writing about it. And the magic word, we come back to George Curios's word, reflection. You said it's really important that you reflect, and that you reflect in a very proactive way. So I'd like to end on that note. Thank you all so very much. I'm just, again, thank you to Mahidol and to the colleagues and to the students here. Thank you to those of you who are online, who are still there, and I hope you haven't fallen asleep. And thanks to my family. That's it. Bye.
Okay. Just the last word, final remark. Thank you very much for you two to come visit our institute and to give some very, very useful talk and something to, think about when you're free time, not including students, including myself as well, because I plan to do a lot of research into, interpretive approach and constructivist as you present today. And I hope that we still keep this meaningful conversation later in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Boyd. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye, Mum and Dad. Bye, Gennaro. Bye, my family. Bye, everyone. See you. Bye.